It's been an honor now to introduce this morning's keynote speaker as an opportunity for us all to consider the larger context for the work we do every day. Jim Shultz is the founder and executive director of the Democracy Center. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from UC Berkeley and a master's degree in public administration from Harvard University. Jim has worked for more than 40 years in public policy and citizen advocacy, including a decade as a global advocacy advisor to UNICEF. He previously served as staff to the California legislature and as an advocate with Common Cause and Consumers Union. He has led successful advocacy campaigns locally, nationally, and globally, and has trained and counseled thousands of advocates on 5 continents. For 20 years, Jim and his family lived in Cochabamba, Bolivia, where he also served as president of an 80-child orphanage. Jim's published writings include 3 books, as well as articles in the New York Times, The Nation, Stanford Social Innovation Review, and other publications. His primary focus is the global climate crisis, the global refugee crisis, and building democracy through citizen engagement. A father and grandfather, Jim now lives in Lockport, New York. Please help me welcome Jim to Dubuque. Jim? Still have those young legs to take that big step.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good morning. How are you? Everybody awake? Everywhere I go, as I travel around the world, I like to ask people how they say good morning in their native language. How do you say it in Iowa? Oh, it's the same. The purpose of talk like this at the beginning of a session in which we have so many people with so much expertise and so much hands-on work on these issues is to try to zoom out like one of those Google Maps and to try to see the broader picture. And that is my goal this morning. And I want to thank the City of Dubuque, Mayor Buell, Gina Bell, and others for making this possible. It really is an honor to be here with you. I want to start with a story. It's an old story. Some of you may know it. And I didn't realize until not long ago that this story comes from the Buddha. And it's a story about a king who wants to prove a point. So he says to his servants, he says, "Bring me an elephant." And they bring him an elephant. And then he says, "Bring me 5 blind people." And so the servants fetch him 5 blind men. And then he says to the blind men, "Okay, there's a beast in front of you, touch the beast and tell me what it is." One of them grabs the tail and says, "Well, it's like a snake." Another one grabs the side of the elephant and says, "You're out of your mind, it's like a rock." Another one grabs the leg and says, "You're both out of your mind, it's like a tree trunk." And the point of this story is that each of them have a piece of the truth, and none of them has the whole truth. And so this is a story about perspective. All of us come to the issue of sustainability with a set of perspectives. And we come to the world with a set of perspectives, blind spots and insights. My blind spots are some of the classic ones these days. I'm a man, so I don't know what it's like to go through this world as a woman. I'm white, so I don't know what it's like to go through this world as a person of color. And I am old. And so I don't know what it's like to be 17. Although I have a daughter who's a junior in high school, so I have some insight into that. At the same time, I think it's important for us to acknowledge the insights that our life experience brings. And the mayor mentioned the 3 that are the basis of how I look at these issues. The first is I have spent the last 40 years as an activist and working on policy, from the inside of government in state government in California to people who do protests in Latin America. So for me, when I think of citizen action, I see a very broad spectrum. Some people, citizen action is putting on a suit or heels and lobbying a member of Congress. For other people, it's blocking a highway. But all of that is an expression of democracy in action in one way or another. The second is having this strange experience of having lived 20 years of my life until just recently in Bolivia, a very different country. For the last 10 years that I lived there, my streets were rocks and dirt. My neighbors grew corn and drove tractors, maybe not so different than Iowa. And I was an alien in somebody else's land. So 2 years ago, I became once again an alien in someone else's land when I moved inexplicably to Lockport, New York. Anybody ever been to Lockport, New York? There you go. Lockport, New York is actually a lot like Dubuque. First of all, it's an old industrial town, and if you substitute the words General Motors for John Deere, you pretty much understand what happened to the economy of the town. If you drove a General Motors car before 1992, your radiator was probably made in Lockport, New York. It struggles with the same issues of how you build something new and something sustainable on top of something old that has a really long history. We don't have the Mississippi, but we have the Erie Canal. And then the third perspective is the very great reason that I moved from Bolivia to Lockport, New York 2 summers ago, which is this. This is Bella. You might think she's kind of cute. She's my granddaughter. She's my first granddaughter. And she is a small person of magical powers. Because she, from the womb, was able to summon an entire family from Bolivia and make a native Californian move to Lockport, New York. And Lockport, New York in February is not California. My superhero is a guy named David Stanley who plows my driveway in the winter at 3 in the morning. I don't need Spider-Man, I need that guy. She is also a small being of magical powers in another way. She's a time machine into the future. Anybody else have grandchildren here? I think you'll know what I'm talking about. Before my granddaughter came along, when I heard things like the year 2050 or the year 2075, I thought about it the way I thought about the year 1910 or 1861 in reverse, which is those are times in which I'm not going to be alive on this planet. Now when I hear 2050, 2075, and even projections about the end of the century, I know that I'm looking at a time in which a human being who I love deeply is going to be alive and living her life. And I have absolute confidence in the ability of her parents, my daughter and son-in-law, to give her a tremendous upbringing. But what I don't have confidence in, and what I worry about deeply, is the world into which she is going to have that adult life. And it is a hard thing to be 62 years old and look at the future and worry about it in the way that I do. And I want to talk this morning about the 3 things that worry me the most. The first is the global climate crisis. I guess I should say at the beginning, I realize there are still people today who doubt the science. And I would just say that a few weeks ago I went to the dentist, and my dentist told me that I had cavities and I needed fillings. I rejected the temptation to go on the internet and look for conspiracy theories about dental work. And I just decided I would go with the expert. So whenever people come at me with all of the frustrating theories about why it's all a hoax, I just go with the people at NASA, and I'm going to stick to that. You know, I don't have to speak to you about the nature of the crisis of climate change. You know about it as people who are technicians in the field and who are working with the impacts of it, like flooding in Iowa and all of that, or as a young person looking at it. Here's how I think about it in a more basic way. You know that guy in your circle of friends who is prone to a bad temper? You don't get him drunk. The Earth's climate system is prone to bouts of bad temper. Climate change gets him drunk. It makes everything worse. I grew up in California. In the fall in California, you have wildfires. You've always had wildfires. We have these crazy Santa Ana winds that blow in hot air that, you know, take us from 80 degrees at sunset to 100 degrees at midnight, blowing hot wind. We've never had wildfires like the ones that destroyed Paradise. This is new. You've had flooding in Iowa, but you haven't had flooding like you've had these recent years. Bolivia's always had droughts, but it's never had droughts like the kinds it's having. Southern Florida has always had the ocean, but it's never had the ocean coming up into its city streets through a sewer. What we are looking at is a planet that is becoming deeply violent and threatening. And history will look back and they will say, well, we've passed through the era of happy obliviousness that ended about in the late 1980s. Then we entered the period of the scientists are warning us and we're not really paying attention. That has continued on until the recent future. And now we've entered the new period in which it's no longer a theory. Now climate change is happening. Look at this photograph. This is from the Bahamas, the one on the bottom. I mean, imagine how many hours those winds just whipped and whipped and whipped the Bahamas. This is the future that we face. And it breaks my heart to think about what it means to be the first generation in humanity. 10,000 generations. You've scored the lottery. You get to belong to the very first generation of humanity born into a planetary crisis. It's a lousy lottery to win. And it is what is happening with our children. And you can see the reaction of young people because they get it. You know, like I said, I'm 62. There are things that my body doesn't do now that it used to do. It used to get up and happily run 5 miles in the morning. It doesn't do that anymore. When you get older, you get used to aging. The planet's not supposed to do that. Our children aren't supposed to be born into the body of a 70-year-old. They're supposed to be born into a new planet. And global climate change is the first of my worries. The second of my worries is the global refugee crisis. I was called to the Netherlands a few years ago by UNICEF to help them develop their government's policy strategy on how to deal with the rush of immigrants coming from the Middle East, from the Syrian crisis. And I don't watch cable television. I consider it a health hazard. But I was watching CNN in my hotel room, and there was this story. It was an interview with a big Hungarian cop who was standing at the border. And there were all these immigrants behind him, refugees coming over this chain link fence that had been broken. And he said, there's too many. We can either let them in or we can shoot them. And we're not going to shoot them, so they're coming in. That refugee crisis has produced 6 million refugees. It's one of the largest refugee crises the planet has ever seen. And it is a drop in the bucket to the projections of climate refugees predicted during my daughter's lifetime. Granddaughter's lifetime. By the time my granddaughter is reaching 30 and perhaps starting a family of her own, projections are for something on the order of 250 million climate refugees on this planet. We're looking at whole swaths of the Persian Gulf that may literally become uninhabitable by humans for more than 90 minutes at a time outside because of the combination of heat and humidity. We will start shooting them. We are literally headed to that kind of a scenario. I was in Mexico in June working with UNICEF again on the refugee crisis in Mexico and understanding the nature of these caravans that got so much attention last year. In my granddaughter's lifetime, and probably before the end of mine, if we have crop failure in Central America, if we have these kinds of things happening, we're not going to be looking at caravans of 10,000 people. We're going to be looking at caravans of 100,000 people. It's important to understand the nature of where we are headed. The climate crisis is a domino. The second domino is the refugee crisis. And we are going to have to decide as a country what we are going to do about that. Because the possibility of our becoming an island in literally a sea of misery is what we face in the future. And the sooner that we deal with it, and the sooner that we think about it in terms of supporting Central America and South America now to deal with the kinds of things we're dealing with here, right? We're getting ready. Those countries don't have the same kinds of political capacity and resources to get ready. And if they don't get ready in the way that we're getting ready in smart places like Dubuque, they are going to come. They are going to knock on our door, and they're going to do it in very large numbers. And we need to think very clearly about how many newcomers we can take in and what we're going to do, and how we're going to try to prevent these crises before they happen. That's my second worry. And my third worry is that just at the moment in which we need democracy the most, our ability to actually intelligently think about the issues and challenges in front of us and deal with it, our democracy's falling apart. That's another domino. I mean, look at the impact of the refugee crisis on politics in Europe. For the first time since World War II, we have a wave of authoritarianism finding a foothold in places like Germany and other parts of Western Europe. This is a scary prospect. In this country, we have completely lost, at the national level, our ability to have any meaningful conversation. All we do is trade insults with one another. We have this glorious system of social media with which we can learn the realities of other people, and we are just using it to insult people we don't know. Our government in Washington has completely lost its capacity to address any kind of major issue. And this is exactly the wrong time for that to happen. Going back to the idea of the elephant and the blind men, we have entered a period in which the guy with his hand around the elephant's leg is completely convinced that the guy with his hands on the tail is out of his mind. One of the great things about living in Lockport, New York, and as you might have guessed, I'm not a Republican, is I live in one of the most Republican pro-Trump corners of New York State. And these are my neighbors. And I've learned an enormous amount about how to respect people who don't look at the world the same way I look at it, and how to have conversations with people who don't look at the world the way I look at it, and it begins with respect. And we're losing that ability. And climate change is a really tough nut on democracy. Why? Because where democracy works really good is when I'm running for city council and I say, vote for me and I will put a sidewalk in your neighborhood. And then I deliver the sidewalk and I come back later and I say, vote for me. Because I've done something very clear. I made a promise, I kept a promise, it's very clear. And who I'm appealing to is right there, the citizen of Dubuque. The future is not voting in this next election, and it's the children of the future. It's, when we talk about the rights of the unborn, the true rights of the unborn, if I'm unborn right now, the thing I'm really worried about is the way the world is going, and I have no vote. And the political system is miserable at paying attention to the interests of people who have no vote. The future has more of a stake in the elections coming up than anybody else, and the future isn't even around to see all the television ads in Iowa. All right, now that I've completely depressed you, let's talk about what has to be done. First of all, this is what should not be done, just in case you were wondering. And yet, this is really our go-to position as a political culture right now, because our capacity to distract ourselves is just unbelievable. As I once read, we now hold in our hands a device that allows us to access all the knowledge of humankind, and we use it to watch cat videos. Our ability to distract ourselves, whether it is with games on our phone, or social media, or Netflix, or it's just easy. This is easy to do. And it has become our go-to position as a culture, is to stick our head in the sand. Not everybody. Not the people in this room, but too many people. So what is it that I think it takes to really step up and make a difference? The first is what you're doing. It begins in our communities. Why does it begin in our communities? Because, first of all, at the national level, we're people who fall on ideology and scream at one another. At the community level, even if we don't agree on anything, we are still neighbors working at a practical level to solve local practical problems. There's no ideology about cleaning up a toxic site or a brownfield. There's no ideology or Democrat or Republican in we have flooding, we need to figure out how to deal with it. These are practical, real problems. And at the local community level, we have an opportunity to actually work together as neighbors and do something about it. And also at a community level, if you are an individual, no matter who you are, even if you're a junior in high school, you can see a way to make an actual difference. Most people, when they look at state level issues or national level issues, they don't have any idea how to make a difference. Those people have spent 15 years building up the political capital to make a difference at the national level. But at the local level, people have a shot at actually making a difference that they can see and that matters. And to do it in community and to do it with one another. And this is why the Secretary General of the United Nations recently said, cities are the first responders to the climate crisis. Cities are the first responders. If you look at, when the United States pulled out of the Paris Accord, who is it that took up the slack? Because remember, the Paris Accord is a set of promises of what the country will do, what every country will do. And since our national government is not stepping up to the plate, local governments across the country and state governments across the country have formed pacts and said, okay, we're going to do it. We're not going to wait for the national government to do it. We're going to do it. So I am deeply hopeful about communities. There's so much vibrancy happening. And what you're doing here is so important because Dubuque has set itself up as an example, not just saying, look at what we're doing, but come see what we're doing. How can we help spread it? Because that's the great thing about knowledge. I can give it away for free, and it costs me nothing, and it makes me better. And so what you're doing here, to me, is not just cool. It is a pillar of what it is going to take to respond to the climate crisis. There we go. The second is a little different. And there's a little story attached to it, an Iowa story, as it turns out. A man who changed my life spent 25 years of his down the road in a monastery. His name was William Wilson. He was a Trappist monk. And he was a troublemaker as a kid, lived in Philly. Somehow he ended up in this monastery, spent 25 years there, and in his early 40s, he was so secluded, he told me he missed Watergate, which I thought was really funny. I told him you shouldn't, it was really great. And in any event, he started reading these pamphlets from the Maryknoll Order of the Catholic Church about Latin America. And so he decided he was called to go to Latin America, and he moved to Bolivia, studied language, and ended up being a hermit in rural Bolivia, and after that started an orphanage in a city called Cochabamba. And in 1990, when my wife and I were newlyweds, we sat down with Father William Wilson when he paid a visit to San Francisco to talk about how we were going to go to Bolivia and work in that orphanage in our first year of marriage as volunteers. We didn't know at the time that we start bringing back the kids from the orphanage to be our children. That came later. But he gave me a piece of advice that I always thought was one of the most genuine pieces of wisdom I ever heard. Because we were organizers, my wife and I. So, so what should we do? Well, should we do that? And he's kind of this, he looks kind of like a skinny Santa Claus who's like he's online to God all the time. He talks like this. He's still around. He's in his 80s. He doesn't look like it. Looks younger than I am. And he said, you should discern what it is you feel called to do and gifted to do. And I just love that. It's the best life advice to this day I've ever heard. What are you called to do and what are you gifted to do? Called to do means what does your heart say you're passionate about? Because if you go down a road to do something in your life that you are not passionate about, it's going to be a very bumpy road. You have to find your passion. And you have to find what you're gifted to do. What is it you're good at? I think we live in a moment in which, in one way or another, we all have to be called to dealing with the planetary crisis in which we find ourselves. That has to be integrated into all of our priority sets. It doesn't matter. If we are a business person, we need to be called to that. If we're a mayor, we need to be called to that. If we're a teacher, we need to be called to that. If we're a high school student, we need to be called to that. It doesn't matter, because this is the work at hand. And then to figure out how to bring the gifts that we have. Everybody has a set of gifts. So if I'm an engineer, or if you're an engineer, I want you to be thinking about how do I use my talent as an engineer? Not to scrub your talent and do something else you're not good at, to take that talent and apply it to this. That's what we need. We need everybody to look at what are the gifts that they have in the world and bring that to bear on this crisis. To me, that's what's fundamental. We need to see it as a shared piece, and everybody needs to see the way they can contribute to it. I was talking to a young woman on the airplane, and on the way here, and she reminds me so much of so many of my nieces. I'm sure you know this. There's this whole cohort of young people in their early 20s who are just starting out their careers, and they are working their tails off. It's amazing how overworked they are. And they're trying to figure out what they're interested in. I want every one of them to have the option of expressing their talent and desires in something that heals the planet. That's my ambition, and I think it needs to be all of our ambition. Here's another one that some of my friends in the political movements might not like so much. We live in a time in which the energy of action around climate change is very oriented toward protest. And I have great admiration for it. It's profoundly inspiring how much a young woman from Sweden inspired 3 million people across the planet to go on strike. I was in the big march in New York at the UN summit 4 years ago. I believe in the power of public protest. It is one element of mass action and democracy to require that we move forward. Here's my concern. None of that actually pulls any carbon out of the atmosphere. As an activism strategist, one of the things I can tell when I look at a movement is what's the arc of what they're doing, the arc in time. I was one of the founders of the Access to Healthcare movement in California in the early 1980s. And that's a movement that still is in the middle of its arc to guarantee affordable healthcare to everybody in this country. And we're talking 30 years. Sometimes movements take 30 years. We don't have 30 years. We have a maximum of 10, according to the latest International Climate Panel report, to do something serious. And so my dream is that we figure out a way to turn the mass activism strategies that are being deployed into something that also does something real. My dream, I wish we could do the mass planting of trees as a protest movement. What if 3 million people had planted 10 trees apiece during those protests? Somehow we don't have 30 years to make this happen. We need to do it now. We can't wait for the national government to change. We can't do that. And so one of my goals when I think about where I want to put my creativity is thinking about how do we take these movements and this power and this energy and convert it into something that it's like those bikes, you know, where you ride an exercise bike and it generates electricity. It does two things at once. We need to do two things at once. We need to express ourselves politically in a way that actually removes carbon from the atmosphere. That's my goal. Yeah, do that. Okay, I'll think about it more now that you've applauded. I'll tell you what I come up with. Actually, I thought of one. Anybody going to see a presidential candidate in Iowa in the next month or two? Raise your hand if you expect to see a president. So here's what I'd like you to ask them. Say to the presidential candidates, so how much do you think you're going to spend in the next 6 months on your campaign? And they're going to say, you know, millions of dollars. Would you be willing to commit 10% of your campaign's resources and energy to planting trees as part of your campaign? Could you have a contest? Who can plant more trees, Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren? You know, we had the ice bucket challenge. Why can't we have the presidential candidate tree planting challenge? You can actually make that happen. You're Iowa. They talk to you. And lastly, we can't lose sight of the bigger picture. You know, I recently got a new phone. That's the first time I ever bought a phone. I've always had hand-me-down phones. And it's got this really cool feature on it that people might have heard about called portrait mode. Do you know what I'm talking about? Back in the old days when we used real cameras where you had to make adjustments, we called it depth of field. But the general idea is you can take a subject like your granddaughter and you can focus on her and make everything in the background blurry. This is our temptation in life, is to bring what's direct next to us into clear focus and to ignore all the blurry stuff in the background. Well, the blurry stuff in the background is the planet. It's those other countries that are struggling. It's those refugees that are on the march. That's all the blurry stuff. We can't live in a world even where the stuff that's important. My granddaughter's important. What happens in Dubuque is important. But neither of those things are the whole world. And we can't relegate everything else to the blurry stuff behind the scenes. We have to recognize that what we're doing is part of a global crisis. We need to take the lessons that we're learning and we need to share them. We need to take the work that we're doing and use it to create inspiration for others. We need to listen to the people who are coming to us about refugee resettlement right here in our own towns and listen to them and make room for newcomers. We need to see the world as a whole and understand that what we are trying to do here is one piece of a small puzzle that is so much bigger, because we can build all the walls we want. We can make them 10 feet tall. We can make them 20 feet tall. We can make them 50 feet tall, and none of them will ever affect the atmosphere. We live in one atmosphere. What we do in this country affects the atmosphere in Bolivia. What people do in Europe affects the atmosphere in India. We are all part of one atmosphere, and there is no wall. The future is one planet, and there is no way to escape in our comfort zone what's happening. The work that you are doing is building a very concrete set of pieces to the puzzle, but always understand that it is one puzzle. And at the end of the day, the puzzle that we are building together on sustainability is about the very most important thing that we do in the world. Because if you take away everything else, if you take away the cell phones and the network news and the impeachment and the this and the that, the only thing that really matters is what kind of a planet we hand to the next generation. We are only links in a chain. We're 10,000. And we can't be one of the last. That's what this struggle is about. That's what these issues are about. I'm grateful to have had this time with you this morning, and I wish you luck in all the work you're doing. Thank you.